shoulder.
It's just bullshitting. It's fun that we're on a webinar right now with people tuning in, and it looks like we're in totally different parts of the world, but we're actually like 8 feet apart. It's just I have a different background.
Yeah. And oh, you don't have your that's a real background. You used to have your fancy fake one. Now you have a
We got a real background. Yeah. You've seen the evolution, because I had the fake background, then I put up those felt tiles that then we fell off.
Yeah.
I was getting head injuries from the stuff like falling off the wall, to then this background. Shout out to Bill from Voice and Video for making the recommendation on the backdrop.
Yeah, the felt tiles were fun because they were just like slowly, like be on a Zoom and you would just see part of your wall fall off.
Yeah, raining down velvet tiles.
Yeah,
the felt tiles. The kids liked them though, because they would just grab them and then paint on them.
Sure.
This is cool. Dad spent like thousands of dollars on these things that I'm now like just destroying.
Oh,
but yeah, we're recording, and this is just maybe the start of a weekly podcast.
Yeah, weekly, bi-weekly, randomly, who knows?
Definitely no guests, that's for sure. I think we're both aligned on the no guests.
Yeah.
And all the coordination. I already have Rigging the Game, so I can have guests that come on to that podcast. We've been talking about potential title called Unexploitable, which I love. So I've been having a lot of conversations with people about how they are exploitable, and we can talk about what I mean by that, and we can talk about what you mean about it. You had a good pause on like maybe why we shouldn't say that. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. It's funny because I was thinking about this when we were firing it up, is when we talk about exploit, people have it has like a negative connotation. And it's partially because I think people don't really understand the word, because it can be used for people to take advantage of other people. But the way that I think about it is, well, first of all, especially the crypto space, and Dan, you're in the finance space, is people automatically think the word exploit means something malicious, and it doesn't necessarily. It's actually the way I think about it. It's the opposite of, because I'm always thinking in shapes. So if you think of a barbell, and this is from computer science, it's the other end, like the diametrically opposed end of explore. So you have explore, exploit. So just to give you an example of how it's used and thought of in computer science, where all the emotion is removed, when you get married, you're exploiting, right? All that means is I have enough information to make a decision that I think I'm going to get what I want. Explore is dating, right? I'm not really sure if I want to exploit. So absolutely there's exploitation in just using the word objectively from a computer science standpoint. When you get married, if you have 10 job offers and you do all your diligence and you're done looking for more, you're done exploring, when you make the decision, you're exploiting. You're saying, given the information, I can get I have the highest probability of getting what I want by making this decision. That's exploit. Now, on the flip side, and I'll let Dan, obviously, because he actually came up with the concept or the idea of talking about it. That also means that if you behave a certain way, or you're impulsive, or you're wired to do silly things, somebody else can look at you and go, I know how humans behave. I could probably get what I want out of them, and they won't necessarily be aware that it's happening. And I think that's the malice that people are kind of have a reaction to.
Yeah, I think that's well said. First off, I love hyperbolic and sort of salacious names for podcasts and otherwise. Like I have a podcast and book called Rigging the Game, and there's a lot of, when I first put out the podcast, got a bunch of scrutiny online from people who are like, you're doing a podcast where you're suggesting a bunch of unethical things. No, not at all. You should read the description of the podcast. But the the point really is about how do we engineer luck, but it carries with some weight and some baggage about what people think about systems being rigged, and how when you exist in this victim mindset, like a rigged system sounds terrible to you, right? It's like, of course, another thing that's working against me because I'm a victim. I think Exploitable has that same sort of reaction to folks who exist in the kind of victim mindset. Things are happening to them and it's outside of their control. But it also creates an opportunity for a conversation. What do we really mean by rigging the game? What do we really mean by exploitable? Here's my observation. We've talked about this a little bit, Nick. Back in, well, both of us don't care for New Year's resolutions unless something's changed. Anything changed now? You're like into New Year's resolutions?
Nope, still hate them.
Goals, still
hate them.
Not into arbitrary goals yet. So I found it really interesting because I was paying really close attention to it in January this year with the book coming out and everything. How I'd ask people what their New Year's resolutions were, and it was some version of, I want to be more disciplined. And you're like, okay, cool. How are you going to go about being more disciplined? And they're like, by having more discipline. Or they'd be like, I want more restraint this year. And you're like, cool. How are you going to go about having more how are you going to go about being more restrained? They're like, by being more restrained. It's like, is this a circular reference? They're like chasing our tail. That's when it started to kind of lead me down this trail of thinking about how people are exploitable. Because it's like I'm defining the solution by using the problem. Like, I want to be more disciplined by having more discipline. And instead of going, well, what if I just didn't put myself in positions where I always had to be disciplined? Or what if I didn't put myself in positions where I needed so much restraint? In other words, I designed systems where I was more energized at the end of the day. So I didn't need to be disciplined so that I could be present with my kids. It's like, it's just going to happen. Or what if I was just less impulsive? Then I wouldn't need discipline so much because I'm being less impulsive. And so I mentioned all that as sort of a frame of reference because these ways that we think about things put us in a position to be exploited. And now I got to actually explain what I mean by being exploited or exploitable. So we talk about this at length in CCA, in my book. You touch on it to some extent in Bumpers. That there's these two tyrants, scrutiny and expectations. We start a business. Most people say, hey, what I want is freedom. That's why I'm starting this business or this new endeavor. I want freedom. But then we're not ready for all the scrutiny and expectations, and we don't understand risk. And we're constantly chasing more. And so we keep getting further away from what we really want. And then we start experiencing this internal set of tyrants, shame and guilt. The outcome of all of that is we're seeking consensus, and we're looking for someone just to give us the answers. Just tell me what I need to do. That's when you're in a position where you're going to be exploitable.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead and respond.
Well, I was like, you know what are the ways to, what are the things that we do or that there's like hardwired into us that make us quote unquote exploitable. And that was one of my said biased. You touched on both. Bias toward positive action, which is like I need more restraint. I need to add something when restraint's really about doing less. So it's really, we have such a strong, anybody that says, hey, the doctor that's like, hey, just take an aspirin and take a nap.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctor that's like, no, I could do a really complicated surgery and you'll be right back up on your feet in 6 weeks. Like, we're like, oh, positive action. That must be good. And that doctor just exploited you for tens of thousands of dollars that you could have actually just taken an aspirin, taken a nap. And the other one that I had, which you just alluded to, was the need for answers where they don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah.
If you need answers, Um, and anybody that about certain things, like anybody that cares about you really knows is going to say, we don't know. That we can give you a range. We can talk in probabilities and risks. But I can't tell you for certain that this thing's going to happen on this day. And so we have such a strong desire for that we're ultra exploitable, because somebody will make that promise. They know how badly you desire this, super specific certainty. And that, so those are two things that I had written down that you touched on, which was just that bias toward positive action. Doing something must be better than doing nothing. Buying more programs must be better than not buying more programs. Doing more in my business must be better than doing less in my business. And then the need for answers where they just don't exist.
There are some tells, I think, when you put yourself in a position where you're at maybe maximum or maximal exploitability, where you say things to yourself like, I just need to do something different. I can't continue on like this, so I just need to take a leap of faith. Right. And so we're in this maybe high degree of pain. And so we're biasing action, to your point, maybe positive action. We think it's going to be a positive action. So we're biasing, I just have to do something different. So now I'm going to take action. Like if you're a salesperson and you get someone to say, I just got to do something different. I can't continue on like this. Perfect. I got you right in my crosshairs. You're ready to buy. I just need to clearly articulate the value and take your credit card or debit card as quickly as possible, or you have a moment of mental sobriety. But I think there's there's a solution. I always stumble over the word I was going to say, but I think there's solutions. Like when you're in that moment of pain, I think about things like climbing a ladder and I'm near the top of the ladder, like pain. How can I take a step down or 2 steps down? And so you say, I just got to do something different. I can't continue on like this. Okay. Well, what do you really want? Oftentimes we can't even give ourselves the answer to that. What do I really want? Other than I just don't want to be in pain. All right, so go for a walk. Take a nap. That's an action. That's a positive action. It doesn't conform to the social norms. Because when you talk about napping, Nick, I have people all the time who are like, I want Nick's lifestyle because they hear about you napping. And someone said that to me earlier this week. And I was like, okay, well, Nick wakes up at 4 a.m. most days because he can't sleep because he's got a bunch on his mind. He's usually in the office at 4:30. And then he's here till 6 or 7, not because he has to, because he wants to. So he takes some naps and he works comes in 6 days a week like that. And Sundays are a half day. They're yeah, okay, I didn't want that schedule. I just want a nap.
Yeah.
Well, then just nap. But the social norm around it is it's a dirty thing to do. Well, but actually, it might be the highest value thing for you to do because it's going to help you get some mental sobriety and therefore be less exploitable.
That's the funny thing about, I was just going to point that out, and I'm glad you did, is I haven't as much, but I mean, you're in the office. I'll nap almost every day. And people are like, well, it must be nice. And I tell all the time, say, okay, try it. Oh, it's so hard. I can't shut my brain off. Yeah. So first of all, it's actually pretty hard. The reason I got in the habit is because it's the most effective. I'll be at the office from sometimes 3:30 a.m. till 7 p.m. And we all know, no matter how much we feel like we need to be working, the brain is not working that consistently. All right. So there's a few things is and if I feel the two points, I think which Dan alluded to, you're at go study sales training. They tell you 2 things above all else: dig for pain, and then paint a picture of the future. Pain and euphoria. Those are the 2 times people are the most exploitable. Or if they're just really tired. like Willpower Doesn't Work talks about how you just don't make good decisions when you're tired. So part of my routine is understanding that if I'm confused, overwhelmed, tired, if I'm feeling like, man, I'm in a lot of pain and I feel a lot of pressure, I got to get out of here, or I'm super excited, I'm super euphoric, I'm so positive about the future that I'm going to buy 6 airplanes, because I have crazy thoughts. Uh, that's actually when I walk out the door, I lay down on the couch, I take a nap to regain sobriety. Because again, I understand I'm the most exploitable in the states of euphoria, and it's really hard. Dan has probably experienced this a ton too. When you try to help people, prevent them from being exploitable, and when you realize when somebody is in a state of euphoria, like honeymoon phase, how many times we're like, hey, honeymoon phase? Nobody wants to hear it. Just let me be happy. Like, yeah, but it's dangerous. Like the level of happiness above baseline is you're going to make bad decisions. So, we have to recognize that in ourselves. I can't tell others to not be happy because that doesn't go over very well. But if you're listening to this, you think about it, like, I think people are at the highest level of vulnerability in extreme states of euphoria.
I was having it while you were mentioning that. I was somewhat tangentially thinking about how we will espouse say things like, why don't people value me more? Right? Value my time, value my contribution. But then the value that how we assess people is based off their effort. So, and I think that creates a trap of sorts that prevents you from walking or napping, because we think that if we just work harder over time, money will come. And that's a big part of, I think, Western culture, in particular, hard work. Early bird gets the worm. I've been jokingly saying to people when I hear that, like, well, what if I don't want worms? What if I want something that's only available at nighttime? Like maybe getting up early isn't super helpful. But we have a lot of folks, and I think this is one of the things we unwire or unwind in CCA, is that a lot of people have business partnerships that the ownership percentages are based off how much effort, i.e. time, they're contributing, and not the value that they're contributing. And so they'll say, why don't people value me more? But then their assessment of everyone is based off how much effort, that is how many hours they're working. And so if you start rewiring how you're assessing your contribution over the course of the day based off value and just focusing on the highest leverage things, then you go, I've created so much value in the first 3 hours of today that I can take a nap. I can go on a walk. This mental sobriety is important because the scorecard is value, not effort. I don't know if I articulated that very well, because that was something I'm still processing myself, but what's your reaction?
I think, we do see that all the time, and we see in the CCA, it takes about 10 weeks, before like the rewiring happens. So come all the way back to the solvable problem. If you don't know about the solvable problem, there's a bunch of content everywhere around it. Is if you don't have a solvable problem and you're not clear on like a value set, then you look around and then what do you measure? It's really easy for somebody who's very clear on a solvable problem and very clear on the value and what they value and the value they bring, to do an hour of work and be like, yep, got closer. That's it, because that's the whole purpose. When you don't have that, then you're exploitable, because then what's going to happen is either via osmosis, just the people you're surrounded by, somebody else will tell you how to value yourself. Like, how many hours did you put in? People are like, oh, I am here sometimes at 3 a.m. Sometimes I come in at 7. I don't, whatever. But the second I start posting my 4 a.m. wake up every single day on social media,
Mhm.
I'm trying to get you in a position to exploit you. Tell you that, right? It's the only reason I'd post that every day. Because if I can get you to believe that this is the way, you know, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to disconnect you from your set of values by showing you, convincing you that this set of values, this, you know, this is how I do it. This is the only way to do it. I'm trying to disconnect you from your set of values if you're clear on them. Um, so we have to be super clear on like, so what if I get up at I was talking to Howard Getson. He just put $40 million into building this tech, and he's walking me through it. And it was 11 a.m. his time in Dallas, and he was just waking up. I'm like, aren't you 2 hours ahead of me? He's like, yeah, I don't really like mornings. You know, and like that. That's somebody that gets it. He gets what he knows what he's trying to accomplish. He knows how he works. He knows himself. He plays his game. He's less exploitable than if he was, because not playing your game, it actually puts you at the biggest risk.
We were having some conversations over the weekend and earlier this week about the shapeshifters who every book they read, their personality tries to conform to that. I was jokingly calling it business multiple personality disorder. It's like, who are you today? Well, you just read Jocko's book, so now you're like Jocko Willing, and then you read Tim Ferriss's book, so you're like Tim Ferriss, and now you've read on and on and on. People keep shifting their way of being. I think that connects back to like you're disconnected from your own set of values. If anytime you read someone else's stuff and then you want to become them, what are your values at really at that point? That is, I think, a hallmark of someone who is exploitable. If I can easily get you to play my game, and so I get to set the agenda. I tell my team, all my teams, like if you're not clear on your agenda and you're not setting the tone, then someone else will. And if you work for me, that's going to be me. Like, I'm going to set the agenda for you. I'm a strong personality. I know what I want. I know what my game is. You might be triggered by that, but this is the outcome of not being clear on your game, your values, your direction, and maybe some notion that we need to be. People will vacillate between being agreeable and disagreeable. So like they start off with like, yeah, like quote unquote happy to do that. Happy to, yeah, I can take care of that. But really they don't want to. They have some baseline resentment over it. I can't believe they're having side conversations. Can't believe they're making me do this. Well, you said no problem. You jumped on it. And then eventually that resentment boils over and then they become disagreeable. My experience with people doing extraordinary stuff, I'll use you as an example. You're never particularly agreeable.
I'm always agreeable.
It's like, I don't mean that I mean that as a compliment and not as a slight, but I can't just walk over into your room and like have you adopt my way of being. If I say something and it's not consistent with your values, you listen to me. You don't insult me. You know, like that was the dumbest thing I've ever said or ever heard. But you go like, yeah, I understand what you said, but I have a different way of viewing this. That's how we've kind of gelled our philosophies to some extent, is both of us are not particularly agreeable.
Mm-hmm. So
that's actually allowed us to get on the same page. I kind of know where you stand at all times. I don't always like it. Sometimes I'm annoyed by it. It'd be nice if Nick just did what I told him to do or what I asked him to do. I don't want to tell you to do things. Like, it'd be nice. We wouldn't probably be friends if that were the case. So just recognize that that there's actually a cognitive distortion that we talk about in CCA about shifting your personality based off the environment that you're in. Your personality should stay the same. You just take other people's ideas and you make them your own.
Yeah, I think it's funny that because we share an office. I think last time I shared an office with Tim as well, and then Trevor, Dr. Kashi, and it's like how I know a lot of business partners that do not get along well. And it's like you guys agree on so much, or you guys must agree. Like, not really. I mean, we fundamentally, yes. But you can use the same set of fundamentals and come to different conclusions. You filter them through your personal biases where like some people want to get up early, some people want to stay out late, some people want to go on vacation and travel, other people don't. So you can have very different conclusions. It's like it's not that we agree, it's that we're both aware of, like, I know who I am for the most part, you know who you are. And we both understand the very concept we're talking about now. We both understand that we can't be exploitable. Or it's okay. We actually, in my opinion, this is my view, this is not a shared view. We can exploit one another ethically, meaning like Dan can say, hey, I have this thing and you probably don't want to do this work. So, my team will just do it. And we don't actually have a lot of stuff like this, but as an example, and to me, I could go, wow, yes, I would like to exploit that opportunity. You still have two winners. It's just being aware that it's happening, being aware that, I have all the information. This is the decision. That's me exploiting. Making a decision with all the information is an exploit play. And Dan on his side, in this case, would also be aware that, okay, I understand what's going on. All parties understand what's going on. When we say exploitable, there's an assumption, and the way that it's used with a negative connotation is that one of the parties is completely unaware that it's happening.
Mhm.
And so just being aware of it means we don't have to agree or be on the same page. Dan has a thing about aligning versus agreeing that's really good. But we do have to be aware of these things and understand that we play our own game, understand ourselves, understand the general direction we want to go, so that we can be disagreeable in a productive way. And it's not personal. That's hard for people because you think that is actually another way. We can tie this back much. That's another way to be exploitable without your awareness. Is people will just agree with you, and when they agree with you, you mistake that for meaning something other than they're just being agreeable. And go back to sales training. Dig for pain. Lucas knows this too. I saw him in the Q&A there. Dig for pain, paint a picture, build rapport. Literally, you want to take somebody's money from them, be super agreeable, make them feel really bad, and then make them a bunch of promises about the future. Like, that's sales training.
I don't know if you have this experience, but I have a lot of conversations with you where we don't actually talk or text. It's like, I have this idea. I'm going to go talk to Nick about this. Here's the thoughts that I have. Okay, actually, this is how Nick's going to respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the conversation never actually happens because I know how you're going to respond. Sometimes I will say, I'm thinking about this and here's what I think your response is going to be. Am I accurate in that? But in the process of both of us remaining true to sort of who we are, our set of values, and not letting other people get disconnected, it actually avoids a lot of confrontations and expedites conclusions without having these long drawn out conversations.
Yeah. And there's not a lot of there's not extreme peaks and valleys, which is I think one of the reasons that because I do that too. Like, oh, I got an idea. I'll pick up my phone. I'm like, I'll text Dan. I already know what, I have a general idea of what he's going to say. Um, so let me kick it around further before we have a conversation about it. But back to the fear and euphoria is so many people are so volatile with their emotions that it's tough because it's like you have a pretty tight range. I think I have a pretty tight range, which makes us less exploitable. Um, so I don't have to be like, well, it really depends on what kind of you ever have those friends or partners or spouses or whatever. We're like, oh, I got this thing. Really depends on what kind of mood they're in. Because sometimes it'll be a hell yes, sometimes it'll be like, F no, get away from me.
Mhm.
And so when there's that much volatility, get all parties are exploitable because there's no baseline. There's not really like a baseline of I could go, hey Dan, I think this. And if you answer it feels like it's way out of left field. That's very unusual. And like that tells me, it probably tells me like what's going on. Um, but if you're volatile all the time, then that would be normal. So it's really tough to tell when you're making decisions uh, from a place that doesn't make sense. So volatility, emotional vicissitudes. Uh, it's another for you from you and the people around you. It's another area in which you can get exploited.
Lucas has a comment in the Q&A where he says, goes the other way too. Just let me be sad. You don't understand me. This is in reference to pain. And people want to stay in pain. We talk about that, preferring the certainty of misery over the misery of uncertainty. I have this whole Dan versus social media thing I've been doing on Instagram specifically, where I show I bought like a year's worth of cliche Instagram posts and reels, and then I do my own version of it, which if you guys have reactions or other things to it, let me know, because some of them are, I have a few more on the edgy side, but one of them is all these list of emotions, and it's like, this emotion is valid, this emotion is valid, this is, you're allowed to feel all these ways. And then my reaction to it is, yes, those are all valid, but it isn't necessarily useful. And we talk about this in CCA and double loop learning and teaching smart people how to learn, being able to delineate between, is this valid? So yeah, absolutely. Your feelings are 100% valid, but right now, with the problem that you're trying to solve, it isn't particularly useful. So what do we do about that? So that doesn't sound particularly empathetic, right? So the other side of that is when somebody says they're sad, people's response is typically valid but not useful, which is they'll say some version of, well, they give a diagnosis or a recommendation. Like, well, why don't you, if you thought about, like I can give a point of reference to when we were going through, my wife and I were going through infertility. And women in particular who go through infertility show the highest levels of depression and anxiety over a 7-year period of time, unless they end up getting pregnant. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. You can look up the Harvard research around this. So there's a lot of depression that can happen during infertility. And so you might tell your friends, like, I'm having a hard time with this infertility and we're feeling sad. And so what do they do in that moment right away? They give you a bunch of recommendations, right? Well, have you guys thought about doing it more? Have you thought about relaxing? And they give you all these. And what are they doing? They're giving valid recommendations, but they aren't particularly useful, because really what that person is saying in the moment is that I'm sad, is for you to say, that's okay. You're allowed to be sad. Instead of, it's actually quite dismissive to people when they say they're depressed and you tell them you'll be okay. Why don't you try this, that, or the other? So yes, the emotions cannot be particularly useful, but your reaction to the feedback can also not be particularly useful when you dismiss it and you give them a diagnosis or how they could be different. And you basically invalidate what they're going through when really they just want it to be understood.
Yeah, there's an example here. I just was writing this down because I'm obviously, for those of you that don't know, if you're listening to this, I am deeply immersed in the crypto world. I love it.
Oh, what? When did that happen?
Yeah, minus the human emotion component. The technology is fascinating, and the fundamentals still apply. There's nothing about crypto has, if you look historically at the adoption of anything ever, it hasn't broken any patterns, any expectations, diffusive innovation, all that stuff. So in the height of euphoria, and I'm going to explain this the best I can, because I think this is what makes people the most exploitable.
Mhm.
My opinion is there's no equilibrium, there's no baseline. And so in the height of euphoria, people would come in and they're like, oh, everything's going up. What should I buy? Should I buy this? Should I buy that? And my disposition is like, well, you make your own decisions, first of all. And second of all, things do regress to the mean. I do strongly believe that a good new technology is going to go up and to the right over time. And I have a very long time preference. And they're like, oh, you are such an a-hole because just tell me what to buy. Tell me how to get rich. Join me in my euphoria. It's like, well, things do regress to the mean, right? And the mean goes up and to the right over time. And I'm a total a-hole for that. More recently, with the market in the gutter, the same people come like, hey, how do you feel about the market? And they say, well, I believe on average, the mean will go up and to the right, and there will be regression to it's not always regression to the mean, right? Like regression sounds like a weird word because it'd go up to the mean. And they're like, wow, this is such a positive environment. Same people that were like, you guys are a-holes are now saying, wow, this is so positive. What that means is that person has no baseline for themselves. If the same thing is on one day extremely rude and months later that same exact statement and said the same exact way is incredibly positive, that person has no baseline, which means they are incredibly exploitable. They're going to ride when they're in their euphoric highs and you go, hey, buy this from me and buy this from me, and they will. They're being exploited. When they're in their lows, they're so scared, you can offer a million ways to get rid of the pain, and they'll just do it because they're in so much pain. They have no baseline to realize, like, okay, actually, I'm in a pretty good place if I zoom out over time to orient themselves. The other example in crypto, just I use crypto examples because it happens so fast, so we get a lot of data in a really short amount of time, is Ethereum, for those of you familiar with the crypto world, was like 4,000, and then it went down to 3,000, and went down to 2,800, and it was like the end of the world. Ethereum is going to go under 2,500. End of the world. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. The same people, Ethereum went all the way down to like under 1,000. The same exact people as Ethereum creeps back up to like 1,500 are like, oh my God, Ethereum is 1,500. This is amazing. This is great news. So it was the end of the world at 2,500, and it's great news at 1,500. That just tells me that there's no baseline. You are 100% shooting from the hip based on how you feel relative to yesterday. And that lack of a baseline makes you uber exploitable.
Controlled by your biases is what came to mind to me. What was I anchored to yesterday? A loss aversion. Someone like Randy Maskell, my mentor and part of the CCA program, his perspective on what happened with Bitcoin and Ethereum is like, I'm still up like 3,000x.
Mm-hmm.
Hasn't sold, has bought at times, but his perspective is long term. Like, I don't even really look at it. So if you're looking at the charts every day, though, you get anchored to where the chart was yesterday. It goes down. You experience loss aversion. And if you don't pause and find some mental sobriety about what you're really optimizing towards, you take an action. And then you're the person who makes decisions based off single data points instead of based off trends. So how much are we being controlled by our biases? Well, some of us then make the mistake and go like, well, not me, because I'm educated and reasonable and etc. You're probably more exploitable because you're operating against the human condition that we're all biased. That's almost worse. There was a comment David had. David's part of the CCA program, so I'd expect nothing less from him. And this comment, back to what we're talking about emotions and people's responses to someone saying they're sad. He says this response to emotions is usually based on feeling uncomfortable yourself with that emotion. We talk about this in CCA. The need to regulate other people's emotions. Why do we feel the need? I can't control someone else's emotions. I'm not inside their body. And I can't control that. But I don't want them to. So we give them some reassurance, you're going to be okay. Because I feel overwhelmed that you're depressed and I'm worried what you might do. So I need to reassure myself. Because I don't want you to feel something. Because I can't handle feeling that. Or we withhold, we talk about respectful versus nice. We withhold saying something to someone else because maybe they might feel something. And if they get mad, what does that mean about me? So you're not really that in control and as stoic as maybe you might think you are, if a lot of your existence is trying to regulate other people's emotions because you can't regulate your own.
Yeah. I'll tackle this one by Monica too.
Yeah.
We're may as well do
Hey,
some
Monica.
Q&A. We don't really have a structure for this. These are all new ideas that we haven't said out loud yet. The difference between personal baseline and a bias. Yeah, two entirely different concepts in my mind. Now, your baseline may be an output or byproduct of biases, like your behaviors over time. So I think of a personal base when I talk about a baseline, I am thinking of a rolling average over an appropriate time frame. So, you gained a pound today over yesterday, and it's like, oh no, end of the world. But the rolling average is you're losing, 1.5 pounds a month for the last 3 months, and that fluctuation is totally within range. So I'm always thinking rolling average. So you can look at Bitcoin as an example, like Randy said. I talked to somebody last weekend who bought $1 million of Bitcoin at $400. You think he cares that it's 17 grand right now? Because on average, that if you just took from when he bought to now, on average, it's just up and to the right.
He would care if he quit his job and did all this other stuff and didn't take risk off the table.
Yep.
But otherwise, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And that's another story about anybody. If you think if I won the lottery or if I got really early on the next Bitcoin, I'd quit my job, then one, don't. And two, you hate your job. And maybe that's the thing you should explore. Because Randy, he's still working. Wes, the guy, he bought $1 million of Bitcoin at $400. Now it's 17 grand. It was 60 grand. He's still working. He loves what he does. So just an aside there. If you say, if I stumbled upon a stack of money, I would quit my job or I'd sell my business, then you hate your business, whether you want to admit it or not. And if you hate your business, I'm going to tell you right now, you are exploitable. You will do all kinds of things to violate your own economic principles to get out of your business. So that's another way is, and that's very common. Dan and I talk to a lot of people that hate their business and or they hate their clients. And that makes them very susceptible to promises of getting out of it. Bias, there's a ton. I mean, there's some biases that are helpful. So if we just talk about not in terms of cognitive distortions, we talk about biases in two ways. One is through personal preference. So I may bias doing events at home, locally, because I don't like the travel. And Dan may bias, it's actually the opposite. Dan biases staying home, staying local more so. So there's biases we are aware of that serve us. Given my solvable problem, what I care about, my bias is to not travel. You're aware of it. You've thought about it. It's an appropriate bias for your goal. And then there's the cognitive distortions where, all or nothing thinking. I'm all in or I'm all out, and not recognizing anything in the middle. So that's how I think about it. There's two different there's the biases that serve us that we are aware of, and we actively, I call it out, Dan calls it out. I will say to somebody, my bias is this. So like understand that this is my bias before I give you an answer. Um, and then there's the cognitive distortions, and I don't know if you want to give an example, Dan, like mental accounting bias, all or nothing thinking.
Yeah, there's 10 main cognitive distortions. If when we again talk about, I have this in my book, actually I have a chart of the 10 unhelpful thinking styles. Should statements, I should have done this, I should have done that. All or nothing thinking, overgeneralizations. We already talked about personality. You change your personality based off whoever you recently interacted with, and you're measuring yourself against that personality as if you could suddenly be that person. These are ways in which we create suffering through anxiety, because they become future oriented thoughts that we can't control. Like, I should have done this. And now I'm ruminating on it. Like, well, that doesn't really that doesn't really solve the problem, what I should have done. But if I'm going to ruminate over it, I'm going to get stuck in that rather than focusing on, well, what can I do based off new information? So you can sort of, your biases are your biases, anchoring bias, loss aversion, mental accounting bias, those things just exist. If you think you're not going to be subject to them, we have a lot of things we could sell you very easily because you're exploitable. The unhelpful thinking things, styles, those cognitive distortions, I feel like those are things that you can triage. You can work on raising your awareness and rewiring the way you think about them. I had a couple of things I wanted to say on baseline. So you mentioned rolling average. I think if you wanted to be really precise, now we could get into a whole other conversation about accurate versus precise. We had that conversation a couple of days ago. Words do actually matter. This is how you're going to stay relevant with AI, etc. If you care about the difference between the meanings of words and you care about distinction. So we can have an hour conversation on accurate versus precise versus facts. Mm-hmm. But if we want to be really precise on your baseline, you could take another cut of the data where you take your rolling averages and you adjust them for rhythms or seasonality. So maybe you're a certain weight during the spring months or fall month, and your diet and everything stays the same and exercise, but you gain some weight going into spring because there's some allergens in the air and that you're sensitive to, and you have more inflammation. And so that rolling average, you could adjust it for rhythms or seasonality. If you don't know your baseline, you cannot really measure your performance. In other words, the impact on the decisions that you're making, because you don't know what the baseline is. So then you run into false attribution. You think that the actions you're taking move the needle, but you can't measure what's called the incremental lift. The incremental lift is the change relative to your baseline. So we see folks who launch new products. This is why we tell folks, take a micro step, get a preponderance of data, set the rules in advance. These are ways in which we're trying to collect a baseline. We're trying to avoid the unhelpful thinking and biases, right? But you launch a new business, right? And everyone says, well, you got to build a funnel and you got to run paid ads and you've got to do all these 6 different strategies. And so you buy all those strategies. Great. If I was a marketing person, I'd love talking to someone who has this notion that the only way the business is going to be successful is if I do all these 5, 6 things. Great. You're kind of exploitable. The problem is when you do those 5 or 6 things is you will never know your baseline, because you don't know which of the strategies worked, which didn't, because you don't know what the baseline sales are. So we can't measure the incremental lift from each individual strategy because we don't have a baseline. So that's why we always take a micro step. You look at every launch that we've done for our collective businesses. It's like a Google, it's like a Facebook post or a one email or something, Telegram to Google Doc. All right. And we just see like, what's just the like, given our audience, what's the baseline level of interest? And then we can measure the effectiveness of, okay, now let's change it to a checkout page, not a Google Doc. Was the checkout page more effective or not? Well, we can actually measure that because we had a baseline. But when you're trying to maximize and do everything at once and have these false narratives of no baseline, can't measure the strategies. So I know you've got more you could say on that.
Yeah, what happens is, and again, we'll probably expand on this in the future if we continue to do these. But just think about, it's all stuff you've heard us say if you're in our world. But you're talking, essentially about isolating variables. And what I find interesting is people don't isolate variables. And I have a million versions of the way I say this. Like, I'm super data driven. So if you collect a ton of data and you really like numbers and you want to know all the details, and you're not isolating the variables, you are not data driven. Like, that data cannot possibly drive your behavior because you have no idea what those numbers, like what input creates what output. The variables aren't isolated. You know that if I do all of this stuff, this is the outcome, but I don't know what this thing or that, each individual variable, how it contributed, which is another way actually that you become exploitable, or that people are exploitable, is they believe they're data driven. They're actually just emotional, and they use data to justify. And if you're not sure if that's you think I'm data driven. When you roll out something new, or when you want to stop something, or you're thinking about changing something, are you doing it one variable at a time? And if not, you're probably not data driven, which means there's a disconnect somewhere. Because that's ultimately, right? Like, does the conversation we had yesterday, I think, where it's like, well, I added email. How can I gauge the ROI? It's like, well, what did your business do before you had email? And then is there any, like you said, incremental lift from email? It's like, well, I don't know. I started it all at the same time. Well, now we have no way to gauge the efficacy of email. Right. And so it's just, if you don't isolate variables, you're exploitable. And the way that you're most likely to get exploited is by somebody selling you the entire, what do they say? Everything under the kitchen sink.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I know some people are having this narrative of like, well, what about these startups that scale? Like, they did everything at once. They did all these things. Well, this is when you gotta check yourself before you wreck yourself here. The way they did it, first off, they raised a shit ton of money in what a lot of times the VCs say, like, we're willing to spend $100 million specifically to get this data over the next 12 months. We want this data, in which case they design from the beginning all these test cases and isolation of the variables across all these different markets so they can capture the data. You just don't know that this has been set up in a very niched, so they slice the data in all these different variables in advance and then went out and collected it. You just assume, you look and go, oh, well, such and such company's doing all this stuff. No, in a very targeted way. You happen to be seeing that stuff, someone else isn't. They just splice the data in that way.
Yeah. We've talked to, I can't remember his name. He's been a client of both of ours separately. But they only do advertising for like Fortune 500 type companies
Mhm.
and startups, and that's exactly what they do. Here's $50 million, $100 million, no revenue goal, no profit goal. So if you live in a world where you don't need revenue or profit ever, then you can do it this way too. And they say, spend this money as fast as possible to get the data.
We want to know how these types of folks behave in this market with this product within this period of time. And so we've spliced it up this way, set up all the targeting, etc., to get that information back. And then the consumer sees it, or the uninformed business owner, and they think everyone is seeing it. It's just not the case. I want to talk about, and before we wrap up, how exploitable you are when you hate your business, or you hate your clients, or you
Oh
hate your
yeah.
employees.
Mm-hmm.
The number, I observed this a lot a couple of years ago, where I was, when I was traveling some to a couple masterminds, particular, not ones that you were leading, of course, but some niche specific stuff, and would see a bunch of folks who were there under the guise of, I want to make more money because I want to have legacy and have more time with my family. And really, they were there because they wanted to be in a totally different career. They hated their business or the nature of their industry. So they had all this pain. And attending the 3-day event was escapism. It's like, I actually could pretend like I'm going to be living a different life when I get away from my family. And even though I said my top priority is I want to be with my family. And I poked a lot of holes in that. Some people got really triggered by it and say, hey, how much do you need to make per month to be able to spend more time with your family? Because you're telling me that's your top priority. Like, I need $3,000 more a month. It usually wasn't some astronomical number. It was like, yeah, $3,000. You've heard similar numbers, I think. Maybe $5,000 a month. I spend more time with my family, be more present. Okay, cool. Look at their books, like, so you're spending like $5,000 a month on average, joining all these masterminds, traveling, so that you could make $3,000 a month to spend more time with your family. But what if you just stop spending $5,000 a month and you just spend time with your family? Oh, I can't do that. Okay. Well, you can't do that because your actual goal is to have a different business. And you don't, maybe you want more time with your family. Maybe like that's the thing that everyone who has a family, you've got to say, like when your parents, I want more time with people. Kind of stopped saying that for a while during COVID when they got what they asked for. Right? It's like, now you got every day with your kids. Well, we can't get them back to school fast enough at that point. Like, so no judgment for me. I don't think any judgment from you, Nick. Just like getting that clarity of, hey, you know what? I'm at this mastermind specifically because I want to start a different business. And because I want to start a different business, these are the 2 or 3 things I actually need to learn. And having that clarity, instead of pretending that you're there for some noble deed to have more time with your family. In doing so, you'll probably stop being so exploited at these events, because when you run an event, you know that half the crowd is here because they want to live a different life. And so you sell them the vision of this different life, and you sell them access to billionaires and the secrets that these billionaires have. And maybe they're not even billionaires, because why are they selling a $2,000 offer or $25,000 offer to spend a week with them?
Those are my favorite.
None of the billionaires I know, you can get that kind of access to the general population. That's a whole other thing. So just having that honest, again, mental sobriety moment, I guess, about what you're really optimizing towards, what you're really going to take away from that event. And then recognizing that if you are coming from a place that you hate your business, your employees, your clients, you're an easy mark.
Yeah. And if you're coming from that place, and we've been an hour now. But if you're coming from that place and you're unaware of it, I think that's the other thing Dan pointed out is like, look, I get there's things that you will say out loud, and there's a noble, like, well, because I want to spend time with my family. Well, that's noble. You don't have to say it out loud, but you do have to be honest with yourself. Like, you really have to be honest about what you actually want. Otherwise, you can go, oh yeah, Dan's right. I don't need to go to these events. What I really want is, you'll keep avoiding the thing that you actually want, because you feel, most entrepreneurs, most people in general, but especially entrepreneurs, they feel guilty about saying what they really want out loud. And it's typically very reasonable. But they say, I want to change the world. I want to spend time with nobody ever says, I just want to, like, not be stressed out for a while. You know, like nobody says that. And that's all. If that's what you really want, then you can craft a plan, and then you're not pretending to want all these other things, because all those other things put you in a position to be exploited by people that know why you're there. You don't have to say it out loud for mostly, like Dan said, most people that run these events, especially the big flashy ones, they know why you're there. You won't say it out loud, but they know, and that makes you exploitable because they know more about you than you're willing to know about yourself.
Boom.
Yeah.
Just Mike dropped it there and just cut out just close the Zoom immediately at that. They know more about you than you know about yourself.
Yeah. And that's when you're not honest with humans are fairly predictable. When you're not honest with yourself, you don't have to tell anybody else. It's probably helpful to tell people that matter. But when you're honest about who you are, what you want, honest with yourself, then at least you know as much about yourself as everybody else, even the playing field. And that's typically not the case.
Well, we're at a little bit over an hour. These are the types of conversations that we have multiple times throughout the day. You'll walk over, I'll walk over, and there's be some random thought. So I guess for the people who are still hanging out here, you guys want us to keep doing this? You want us to record these? I mean, we're having these conversations regardless. So let us know if this was useful or if it was just a couple blabbing idiots. I mean, both could be true, I guess.
Yeah, we could be useful.
Useful and rambling idiots. And
this is an example of a micro step. Actually, I was actually like, we should actually have this conversation out in our little office space by the studio. But that requires like pushing a bunch of buttons and fixing the lighting and stuff. So it's like, let's do it from our desk. It's micro step. If people want us to keep showing up, maybe we move out to the studio and have like, you actually just see us have a conversation like we normally would.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have this whole fancy studio. Maybe we'll go out there and actually use it. All right. Well, 3 people liked it. So that's cool. I mean,
it's cool.
That's enough.
We'll take 3. It's better than 0.
3. Yeah, more than 0.
And then pay attention however you heard this. If you're in the Rig in the Game channel or the Nick Peterson channel, if and when we do it again, it'll probably just get announced on the same channels for now.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Nick, I guess I'll see you around.
Yeah. I'll see you in like 12 seconds.
Yeah. Peace.